Here we go. All right.
Well, welcome.
Good to see you, Tom.
Prairies and oak trees and nighthawks and badgers, hazelnuts, orchids, towhees and blue azures. I'll wander these hills and love each last smidgen. Then one day I'll die like a passenger pigeon. Start with your first love, just what doesn't matter. Sunflowers start blazing, or chickadees chatter. Pour every last drop of your blessed life in it, and days will be eons, and years infinite. As a child I walked creeks with my toes in mud squishing, crawfish and turtles and snakes and good fishing. I didn't know then that I never would leave. So many times yet, the same joy I receive. Start with your first love, just what doesn't matter. Sunflowers start blazing, or chickadees chatter. Pour every last drop of your blessed life in it, and days will be eons, and years infinite. Oh, the goal is not mastery of names or equations. It's finding a home for your living occasions, for birthing and loving, striving and dying, for beauty and wonder, crawling and flying. Start with your first love, just what doesn't matter. Sunflowers start blazing, or chickadees chatter. Pour every last drop of your blessed life in it, and days will be eons, and years infinite. Start with your first love, just what doesn't matter. Sunflowers start blazing, or chickadees chatter. Pour every last drop of your blessed life in it, and days will be eons, and years infinite. Start with your first love, just what doesn't matter. Sunflowers start blazing, or chickadees chatter. Pour every last drop of your blessed life in it, and days will be eons, and years infinite.
Oh, that musical introduction. Welcome to A Step Back in Time. I'm going to start off the presentation today really looking at this from the standpoint of an ecologist. I worked in the field for some decades. The kinds of things that I do in the field to go back in time and to understand what the landscape looked like in the past. Jackie's going to give you a lot of resources, many of them online, that you can use if you'd like to practice this on your own. So one of the key questions, this question takes a number of forms when I work with students and college interns, is why is the past important? Why is the past of nature in particular important? After all, it's in the past. We can't get back there, or you can't go back. As much as I would like to some days, I can't be 30 years old again. I can't make time go backwards. So looking at this cornfield, there's no way I can make it time reverse itself and bit by bit go back to the prairie it once was, with the first plow moving backwards through the field and slipping out of the first furrow, and the prairie fully present as it once was. And so if I can't do that, why is the past important? And my, there's two questions there. First, why is it important? And if the answer you give is a stock answer that you've heard other people say, then I would suggest it's probably not the true answer for you. You need to really think about that yourself. And the other thing I would ask is, why would we want to go back? Why is this past important to us, to me, to you? Why is it important? That's absolutely key to conservation and ecological restoration as we understand it today. And we need to understand ourselves, and we need to be able to explain it to other people. But let's imagine for a moment that it is worth going back. And so let's ask, how can we learn about the past? And one of the ways is we can look at land use history. Jackie's going to give you lots of resources in the second half of the presentation today on how you can go back and look at information that can tell you a lot about land use history. I find the period of history that is most ignored by those who love nature is the farming era, because we love to tell stories about glaciers and Native Americans, and we like to tell stories about restoration and the natural areas today, but we don't like the time in between has slipped away, and we kind of ignore that. And that's a really bad mistake, because up to 200 years of, or close to 150, 180 years of history have been influenced by this, this period of time. And it's impossible to look at the landscapes today without understanding how they were influenced in the past. For instance, this is one of the wonderful resources in 1873 Plat Book that was done in such delicate detail. This is northeastern McHenry County, where Glacial Park is today. Actually, Lost Valley Visitor Center sits right here. This belonged to Samuel H. Walker in the past. And we can listen to the past. There are actually firsthand accounts. Most counties, if you start looking for them, will have a history of, fill in the blank. And it's written, it's fascinating reading, because these are people who are actually there or only a generation or two separate from the first settlement. And while they have a point of view that may be different from ours, it's very important to listen to them. This is an account from Colby Benton, a young man who visited the Chicago area in 1833 on the sort of trip of a lifetime. As he was a young man, he came through, I think, Pennsylvania into southern Michigan, around the southern tip of Lake Michigan, and then up into the Chicago area. Just imagine Chicago is mostly low prairie covered with grass and beautiful flowers. A little hard to visualize today when you go downtown. He then went up into Wisconsin near Lake Geneva, and then came from Lake Geneva. There's wonderful descriptions of Lake Geneva prior to any modifications. Then down through the western part of McHenry County in the vast outwash plain west of the Marengo Moraine, and just east of the Illinois Age moraines in the far west of the county. He saw this. It is hard to imagine today. I was struck with the wonder and astonishment. It was greater than the falls of Niagara. If you've been to Niagara Falls, that's pretty great. It's many of the things, the Midwest becomes boring to us because we have lived here too long and we don't see it with new eyes. And we can look at what's left. And this is where really what I do, a lot of my work as an ecologist, is look at the landscape as it exists today and try to understand what it can tell us about the past. And to do that, if you remember, if you were with us last week when I talked about geology, that's a principle. I should have put this on a little quiz, but you remember the name of that principle, that the processes in the past act the same as they do today? It's called uniformitarianism. So if I want to understand how things changed in the past, I should look at how things change today and try to reason from one to the other. And this is what we did in Glacial Park this last summer. In fact, I was resurveying the ground flora and trees in Glacial Park for the first time since 1986. And just say, this could be a very large presentation. I'll just show you a couple of graphs. Here here is the change over 33 years in basal area. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the basal area of a tree is a cross-sectional area of the trunk, which seems like a peculiar measure, but you can calculate it from the diameter. And it's a good proxy for biomass, which is why ecologists like it. And we can see that for white oak, which is Quercus alba in the left-hand column, and for bur oak here, Quercus macrocarpa, you can see that the basal area increases, which isn't surprising. Trees grow over time and the trees get bigger. If we look, on the other hand, at density, or the number of stems out there per acre, we can see that in both cases, the number of stems go down for white oak and for bur oak. And so those would seem to contradict one another, but again, it's really common sense that if you have the same trees, some of them die. They all grow, but some of them die. And so your density goes down, but the growth is more than enough to show an increase in basal area. Notice that this is Hills oak, or sometimes called black oak or scarlet oak or northern pin oak. It goes by a number of names. Its density actually increases and its basal area goes down, so it's just the opposite. Hills oak has suffered a lot from oak wilt, and so a lot of the big trees have died. You see the basal area going down, but it's the only one of the oak species that has reproduced in the modern era, and you see its density going up with smaller trees. And we can see that white oak and bur oak, on the other hand, haven't been reproducing. So that gives us an interesting perspective on what the woods are today relative to the past, because the past, they must have been reproducing if they were dominant for, it turns out, something like 10,000 years. So we've got a little glimpse into the past of oak trees and how today differs from the past. We can also look at the ground flora. The central cartoon, when I first used this, there wasn't quite the opposition that there is today, but this is a way of looking at species and categorizing at the extremes as either opportunist and disturbed areas. So we have ragweed over here that grows along roadsides that are pretty highly disturbed areas, or old fields, farm fields that are abandoned in the first couple of years. And then we have these remnant dependent plants like marsh vetchling over here that occur, as far as we understand, in relatively intact natural areas. But you notice there's an evident or obvious circularity in my reasoning, because I'm drawing conclusions about the plant from the place and the place from the plant. But we can step out of that circularity because we can see that the disturbed area is indeed receiving a disturbance. And we know that it was a cornfield a year ago. And so we have a confirmation that this is a plant of disturbed areas. And likewise, though a little less directly, we can look at some of these remnant natural areas, remnant prairies and savannas, and speculate that they escaped most of the disturbance of the modern era. And so what we're trying to do is to try to understand what the landscape looked like in the past. And so this gives us one method for doing that. It's called Floristic Quality Assessment. So we give every native species a coefficient of conservatism, hence the conservative liberal cartoon, from 1 to 10. Plants with a CC of 10 are rare, usually occur in high quality remnants, and plants with a CC of 1 are very common, even in extremely disturbed weedy areas. And all the other species are given a coefficient between 1 and 10. And so if we want to judge the floristic quality or integrity of some place, we look at the floristic list from that place, and we look for the average coefficient of conservatism, called the mean C. So we start with something like this. This is on the right side are data forms I filled out this last summer in Glacial Park, 6 quadrats in each one of the plots where I had measured the trees. And on the left is the same done in 1986. And this is just a very, very simple version with only 4 species in which we have a CC for each of the species, and we get a mean C of 3.5. This is widely used, fairly straightforward, certainly something you should learn about and and perhaps use in trying to make your own judgments about the relative degree of disturbance of places where you may be visiting or wondering about. I would caution, I'll talk about a number of methods today. I would caution against using any one of them to the exclusion of others. If my life as an ecologist has taught me anything, is to look widely at many different sources of knowledge and to try to weigh one against the other and not get stuck on one or the other. I mean, it's the yellow coneflower has a CC of 4, which means that is trying to average in a lot of factors, how it would respond to cattle grazing, to horses, to occasional plowing in the 19th century and abandonment, to shading sometime in the 20th century. All of those very different disturbances are all sort of brought together and averaged out with a number like 4. If each place has a slightly different group of disturbances over time, these species and their actual behavior won't be exactly a 4. There'll be something else. But this is a way of taking an average and getting a first cut assessment of what the ground floor tells us about the degree of disturbance and the degree to which the thing you're looking at looks something like it used to. There's another way we can go back into the past, and that is to look at fossil pollen. Now, you and I can't do this, but people do it in the very places where we go to visit. You go to lakes and wetlands, you take cores into the sediment, and the pollen that originates in the plants growing around the lake or wetland then ends up in the wetland itself. You then look at the relative abundance of the pollen grains, and you can reconstruct vegetation going back very, very far. The closest one to Glacial Park where I work was done at Volo Bog. And this is pretty typical of pollen cores I've looked at in the Midwest. What you see here prior to about 10,000 years is a dominance of spruce. Maybe a little hard to imagine the Chicago area covered in spruce forest, but indeed that seems to have been the dominant vegetation: spruce, some pine, and some, some birch over here. So a mix of things that are very northern in their affinities today. Around 10,000 years ago was a dramatic warming in climate, and you see oaks rising rapidly to dominance all the way into the present. And that's pretty typical of pollen cores you see anywhere near the Chicago area here in the Midwest. One of the interesting things about looking at pollen, going farther back in time than we usually think about when we talk about native landscapes and ecological restoration, is that if you think about 18,000, 20,000 years ago, the whole area was covered in an ice sheet. And so none of the plants we're familiar with today were growing here. They all had retreated southward, or populations had retreated southward into warmer climate areas, into refugia from the Ice Age, and then they migrated northward after glaciation. This is just a diagram from a lady or a professor named Margaret Davis, I think in the late 70s or early 80s. She was mapping out the northward migration. I believe this was oaks. I can't remember the species, but this is typical of her estimates of that northward migration. It's interesting to think about, because what it tells you, even the species we think of as native to the Chicago area weren't here. In the relatively recent geologic past, they all migrated into this area and sorted themselves out into landscapes, and may have been even dynamically changing at the time Europeans arrived here. One of the things I do as an ecologist, so it's a lot of habit today that I don't even know I'm doing it, is you use process-based models. And again, we think about that principle of uniformitarianism from geology that says processes in the past are operating as they do in the present. So if I want to understand how fire moves, how it affects plants, how it moves across a landscape, I look at how it does that today, and I reason backwards to think about how it might have influenced the past. And fire today and in the past kills and injures plants and animals. It creates opportunities for seed germination. It increases sunlight intensity at the ground surface, and it volatilizes and releases nitrogen and releases basic nutrients into the organic litter. So these are consistent things that happened in the past and the present. And so we can think about how fire affected past landscapes.
Hey, Tom,
Well,
I got a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Is there any estimate how tall the ice was around northern Illinois?
Good question. There's a long and a short answer to that, but probably we're talking about thousands of feet of ice in the Chicago area. Used to be where people were making estimates of a couple of miles. Those were certainly true of the center of the ice sheet around Hudson Bay, but it was probably thinner around its edge. Glaciers moving down into temperate regions were moving on a skim of ice, and so they were thinner and moved more easily along their edges, and we now think there was only a few thousand, just say that just a few thousand feet of ice, just try to imagine a few thousand feet of ice, but essentially they left nothing underneath. So all the plants were obliterated by that movement, and only their populations would have migrated southward to get out of the way of the cold climate. Okay? So when we look at fire as a mediating factor, I've just divided this up into 3 different groups of plants. This is sort of simplifying, just like Floristic quality assessment simplifies things. Grasses are herbaceous plants, meaning in the dormant season, all of their above ground parts are dead. And so fires really don't affect the living part below ground. At least the important grasses in a pre-European settlement landscape were perennial. And so the perinating organ, the living part, was below ground at the time of a fire. And the basal meristem is why you use grass in your front yard, because grass isn't like an oak tree that sets a terminal bud at the tip of the stem at the end of the growing season. Rather, the growing point on a grass blade is at the base. And so when you mow it off, it just pushes the grass blade upward. When you mow the lawn this summer, you need to get down on your hands and knees and look at the grass right before you mow it, and you'll still see the same ragged edge that was left from the last time you mowed it. If you mowed off something like a little woody plant seedling, what you'll see is a dead stub of the woody plant, and it will sprout from below and try to grow up again. So very different growth strategies. Grass seems to be ideally suited to surviving in a fire landscape. Oak trees are woody plants, meaning they have a living part above ground that can be killed by fire, when it's young anyway. But it does sprout very aggressively from the root collar. It has very thick bark as a mature tree, and it germinates below ground. So the stored food in an acorn stays below ground, and the little shoot comes above ground, meaning it's protected from fire by its storage below ground. Whereas a maple tree is both woody plant, therefore vulnerable. It's a weak root collar sprouter. It has very thin bark, and it germinates and lifts the cotyledons above ground. So they're very vulnerable to fire in that first year. And so when we look at this, now we're gonna take this model of how plants respond and then think about how fire moves across a landscape. And today, if you do any ecological burning, you know that burning off a big flat field of grasses is super easy if they're at all dry, and you've got even a tiny bit of wind. The wind will take that fire across the grass thoroughly, completely, and burn virtually 100% of the area. If you have river valleys and bodies of water, they stop the movement of fire, which we use today as fire breaks in prescribed burning. If you have hills and valleys, they can slow or stop the movement of fire, such as when we're burning in the savannas of Glacial Park. You usually have to light and then relight again and then relight again, because the fires, even though they would burn very easily outside of the woods, move much more slowly and more difficultly in the woods. And we assume they did that in the past also. So we develop a spatial model, an oak grove in a prairie landscape with a prevailing wind and fire approaching it from, more often than not, from the west and southwest sides. The most fire-resistant sort of woodlands would have been bur oak dominated savannas with some hills oak, probably mostly as shrubbery in those woods. As we move more into the center of the grove, it was dominated by white oak. You can see this pattern replayed over and over and over again as you go to the forest preserves and conservation areas in the Chicago area. They don't look like eggs like this one, and then if you have a fire refugia, often in the center of the woods or downslope toward the bottom of a slope or hidden in steeper topography, you can have red oak and sugar maple forest, the most fire sensitive. sorts of vegetation. We can then take that model and put it into a sort of more realistic model. And while this model of a sort of morainal grove along a river valley, again, if you just look at a map of the Chicago area and see how the forest preserves, and often conservation areas, particularly along the Des Plaines River and the DuPage River, West Branch and East Branch, how the forest preserve runs right along the river valley because of the fire protection the river offered, and because of the rougher topography right next to the river, slows down and stops the movement of fire. You have a white oak woodland developing inside of the bur oak savanna with prairie on the outside. And more often than you would think, sugar maples and red oaks sort of clustered together with some basswoods on the steeper, what's called the riser along the side of the river valley. So if we see that landscape today, we may see something like this, where the bur oak savanna is completely gone. It was cleared and farmed. And if we're doing restoration there and we want to rebuild it, we use that fire process model as a way of putting back the things that used to be there. We can use a public land survey for going back into the past. So here is a picture that was, this picture was actually drawn in St. Louis, but it was drawn from the notes of surveyors who walked these section lines. And this is a 1 mile square section. And they walked every one of these lines. And as they walked them, they were noting a number of things like the quality of land for farming, the general kind of vegetation, whether it was timber or prairie, the presence of streams and water bodies, species of trees. Every time they came to a corner, like this corner right here, this would be out in the prairie, so they wouldn't see any trees, but a corner in the woodland, if I can find one here, yeah, I can't quite see a corner in the woods here. We have a corner in the woods. You would then identify the nearest tree in the northeast, southwest, northwest, and southeast quadrants and the distance to that tree. So we have a record of the spacing of trees and the species. Very useful today in trying to understand what our woods looked like in the past. And a few notes, not as systematic on the underbrush, often described as hazel and oak scrub. So the public land survey system, the way that works, and the way if you want to go to Lost Valley Visitor Center and look at the original surveyor's notes or copies of them, you will need to know how to use this system. So first of all, you find your township, like the Richmond Township, and then you find its location in this overall grid system. And I'll show you the larger grid in Illinois later, but there's a principal meridian, sort of the y-axis, and a baseline for that, the x-axis. And this is 3 townships. This is a township, 6 miles on a side, 3 townships north, T3N, and 4 ranges east. So T3N, R4 east, township 3 north, range 4 east. When we're subdividing that section and want to describe just a part of it, we refer to halves and quarters, and then to quarter sections. So if you want to look up your, find out where you are, you get a topographic map. Again, Jackie will give you lots of resources for that, but if you find a topographic map, you'll see the section numbers on that and the township designations on the map, and you can then find out where you are and which of the lines you want to look at. Here is the 3rd principal meridian and baseline used to survey almost all of Illinois. There's a bit in the northwestern part that was surveyed from the principal meridian to the west. And looking at a PLS map like the one on the left, I love looking at them because you're getting a glimpse of a world that you'll never be able to see. But that glimpse, as I've said with all the other methods, each glimpse has its problems. This was created at the time of European, or immediately prior to much of European settlement in the area. But think about this, the surveyors walk these lines. And so the surveyor is walking this lower line, walking from east to west. He leaves the prairie and enters the timber and notes that as he does so. And the cartographer in St. Louis reads that. And then he leaves the timber and enters the prairie there, gets to this corner, and we'll say, for instance, that he turns north and goes this way, and east and goes this way, and south and goes this way. They didn't actually go around each section like that in order, but they ended up doing all those lines at one time or another. So all the person in St. Louis knows is that they entered the timber here and left it here. They have no knowledge about what goes on inside of the section. And so what that cartographer did was just go whoop, just drew a little arc to connect those 2 points that he had information on. We now know, looking at the landscape and the remnant vegetation, that that timber went well up north, probably 80% through that section and then down again. So when we read this map, we pay particular attention to where they cross the streams here, but not to the wiggles of the stream in between those 2 crossings. We pay particular attention to where they enter and leave timber, and not the cartographer's conventions for how to deal with the center of a section. Here's an interesting story that's that unfolds when you look at this is an 1837 original survey in section boundary between section 28 and 33 as he was walking from east to west. They measured distance in chains, which is 80 chains to a mile. And to explain the whole bizarre nature of English measurements would require days. But a chain, if you square a chain is 66 feet. If you have a square at one chain on the side, it's 1/10 of an acre. And so you can see these English measurements all relate to one another. So after about 30 chains, he hits Nippersink Creek. He says it's not navigable, probably too shallow, runs northeast. It's running this direction, 70 links wide, that's about 50 feet. Probably springtime, the current is swift. He then keeps going and crosses it again, only 8 chains or about 500 feet later. The cartographer says, well, that's pretty close. I won't have the stream go woo down all the way down here. I'll just have it go down a little bit. And it's now runs southeast. It's going this way and about 60 links wide. So we know the location of the stream. We know which way it was going. We know about how wide it was. We can look at it today. Here's an aerial photograph from the early 2000s, and we can see that this first is pretty close. It's moved a little bit. But if we go to this downstream part, it's moved 320 meters, or that'd be about 1,000 feet east. And if you visit this today, this is a very aggressively, rapidly eroding meander bend there. So it's pretty easy to imagine that over 180 years, this has moved a lot. So we can understand. Here we're understanding something about the dynamics of streams and how they work and how they change. Certainly erosion and meandering could have happened much more rapidly during the era of European settlement because of all the destabilization of land and the changes in hydrology. But we still see that streams are active, moving systems. So here the goal of restoration wouldn't really be to put the stream back here. We can't, that wouldn't make any sense, but it's to try to look at the stream where it is and try to imagine how we can make it more like the streams of the past. And that's some of the restoration work we've done on Nippersink Creek over the last 20 years. It's not to try to make it exactly like the distant past, but to use the past as a model. Because we can see here, this is surveying work I did in the early 2000s, looking at the modern channel of Nippersink Creek. The water is down here in the bottom. It's fairly deeply incised into this former plain, or the sort of glacial lake plain in which it crosses here. And we can find remnant channels far away from the original channels, but pretty convincingly stream channels. They'd only could have been created by the ancestors of Nippersink Creek. We find they're much smaller. The stream was carrying you see peak flows on streams today are much, much higher because of a drained landscape and all the impermeable surfaces in the world today. So the stream is really a very, very different stream than it was in the past. And unless we could restore the hydrology of the entire Nippersink watershed, we can't really restore the stream channel. All we can do is look at the past, learn from it, and try to ask what can we do to try to ameliorate some of the worst conditions of today and to make it more like the past. Here we're going to look a little bit at soils, one of my favorite topics. Here the surveyor was walking north from the section on this boundary between sections 29 and 30 and encounters timber. We can see it on the topo map over here. We'll talk more about topo maps here in a minute. Just a quick look at a soils map. Jackie will give you a lot of resources for how to look these up. The soil map says we're leaving this bottomland soil down here and going into a Fox soil series and then up into a Casco. Those are both nominally woodland soils. I say nominally because, again, I don't trust any one piece of information. The purpose of soil surveys was to aid agricultural development of the land and to inform farmers. And so their purposes were slightly different than ours in looking at soil today. And because when you ask different questions, you come up at least sometimes with slightly different answers. But we can go back to that area today and look at the soil, which is what we're going to do right here. We're standing up on that same hill where the surveyors entered the woods, right about the same place. We're taking in what I think is one of the prettiest views in Glacial Park. You can see the big canes straight ahead of you, probably a half mile away, maybe more. Woodland that lies south of Lost Valley Visitor Center. There's a visitor center in the center of your view. As we pan northward, we see one of the restored cames and then the other in the vast expanse of the Nippersink Valley. It's a beautiful view, one of the prettiest ones in the park. The reason I brought you here today is to take a look at the soil. And here we have it. And we can see there's a lot of rocks in this soil, even up very near the surface. Now, one of the reasons for this is on a hillside, and so it's been eroding, particularly with cattle grazing, maybe even some plowing or other disturbances in the past that mobilize the top of the soil and it moves down slope. And so, but it leaves the rocks behind. And so even this surface here has quite a few pebbles in it. It gets rockier as we go down. You can see the color changing. The grasses have added some organic matter here at the surface. I suspect this isn't the original organic matter from the original prairie or prairie or woodland that was here, but rather stuff that's just been added over time as the surface erodes. But we can see the pebbly nature of the soil. You see the bright color down below. This is typical of a soil that is well drained. We're along a hillside here, starting to get a very considerable sand content. Now what happened here is the glacier overrode a gravel deposit, and so it smeared this clay stuff here, the glacial till on top, incorporated some of the pebbles. It's very clay and silty here. It becomes sandy, and then at the bottom you can see the loose gravels of the outwash. That layering of till over outwash, very common here, right where the surveyors were entering a woodland. And we'll look at next we'll look at another soil originally very similar to this, but which hasn't been eroded so much. Okay, so right now we're going to take a closer look at the soil. Without going into a lot of details, when we look at soil, we divide it into layers that we call horizons. And we can see this upper layer that I refer to as I was augering it out. And it's pretty homogeneous, a little bit darker up here at the surface where the grass has added a little organic matter. But down to about here, it's pretty homogeneous. And what this is material that's been eroded and deposited here. We call that colluvium. And now we're getting down to the original soil that was buried. And the first thing we see here, it gets a little bit darker. This is probably a remnant of the original topsoil right here. And then we hit a layer that's very silty and smooth to the touch. That's called the E horizon, or the zone of leaching, because water has moved down through this soil over thousands of years and taken the clay out of it and moved that clay downward, leaving behind a very silty soil that, when it gets a little moist, is very slippery and smooth. Now that clay accumulates further down in what's called the B horizon, and this area is much heavier and stickier to feel, and I can mold it into shapes much easier because it has a lot more clay in it. Now this movement of silt or clay from this zone to this zone, not very far, that takes thousands of years. That's typical of a soil that matures under oak trees. And so we're out here in the middle of a grassy field, probably 200 or 300 yards from the nearest oaks, and yet we can look at the soil and see that this soil right here matured under oak trees. So we have some confidence that the trees we planted here in the last 5 years are for a good purpose in restoring the oak woods that was once here. I'm going to skip this slide. Where the second place that I was looking at soil was in a slight depression on a hill, and if you want to see the original soil, you look for those depressions, because that's where the original soil didn't erode away. So you pick your spots to find the original soil. Had I gone to the top of the hill only 30 feet away, I wouldn't have found that E horizon or that zone of leaching that's really the confirming evidence for the presence of woodlands in the past. So let's talk a little bit about topographic maps. Jackie will give you a number of resources. These don't seem to be about the past, but for me, they've always been. I know I'm a dinosaur ecologist out of the 20th century, but.
Hey, Tom, we had a question on soils.
Okay.
How deep does the OA horizon go?
Well, in a typical, now if we do a soil workshop, then I'll show you some soils in what are now woodlands. You're typically looking at an A horizon, which is the mineral soil enriched with organic matter that is generally around 4 inches or so. It can be 6, it can be 2, it depends where you are. If you're getting into prairies, you can have anywhere from 15 inches of much darker soil in a sort of moist to slightly wet prairie. You can have hill prairies that have 6 or 8 inches of topsoil, lighter in color. So there's a wide range of soils, not as simple as just the dichotomy of prairie and forest. But so what I was seeing there in that first sample was an A horizon that was created by just the grasses that you see growing there today. The second one was a pile of colluvium on top of the original soil.
Follow-up question to that. Is that related to root depth in prairie, or is root depth due to A horizon depth? And we also had a question of how the samples were actually collected. Did you do a vertical core down to the soil?
Yeah, well, I skipped the video that showed me augering because I didn't want to show the time. But it was connected. It was a 2.5-inch Dutch auger. I can probably the most versatile tool. There are many. I own a whole collection of soil sampling tools. That's probably the most versatile one. And then you take it out about 4 or 5 inches of soil at a time, and you reassemble the core, making sure you keep track of the depth from which you're taking it and laying it out in the correct order and at the correct depth, and then you do your soil description from that. There's another question there. Which?
Is the OA horizon related to root depth in prairie?
Oh, well, it is related to the depth of really intense fine root development. I mean, the roots of prairie plants, depending on the substrate, can go down 30 or 40 inches if it's glacial till, because after that, you're just sort of boring into a rock. And in sandier, looser textures, they can go down 6 or 8 feet, and yet the topsoil, the black A horizon, is generally 15 inches or less. So it's really the depth of intense fine rooting. The fine roots are the ones that grow out and die back repeatedly during the growing season and are adding that organic matter to the soil. Many of the deeper roots are perennial and live from year to year, and so they're not really adding a lot each year, where it's the fine roots near the surface that are generating most of the soil organic matter.
Thank you.
Okay. We can ask questions, you know, at the end of Jackie's presentation on the whole shebang when we're finished. But just some conventions in topographic maps. This is I still find them one of the most useful things to get my hands on when I go to a new area. This is the convention for talking about elevations, is by these lines or lines of equal elevation. We take these two hills and we turn them into this pattern, which may seem abstract to you at first. For me, the landscape pops into 3 dimensions. If that closed contour is not on a hill but a depression, we put these little hatchers there to denote which way the slopes are going. If we have here, it looks like a morainal upland up here, a lowland down here, and streams coming off of the upland running downward, cutting and creating these V shapes. Once you learn to read a topographic map, when you see those V shapes, you instantly visualize the stream running this way downhill. So again, back to where the surveyor stopped along that slope, fairly gentle slope that when the topo lines get close together as they are here, it means the slope is steep. Over here, it's more gentle. Here is an area just to the west of the park. This is Keystone Road over here. And you can see the characteristic look of a moraine. Remember from last week, if you were with us, made of glacial till, at least near the surface, very dense clay. The water doesn't go through it, rather it runs over it and creates these little stream valleys. And you see the streams cutting back into the moraine, all of these little ephemeral stream valleys. So when I look at a map in the Chicago area and I see that shape, I know I'm looking at an eroding edge of a moraine. As opposed to, here is an ice contact landscape right in the center of the park. This is Kettle Marsh. Look at this really steep slope north of Kettle Marsh. This is really you'll get completely gassed walking up that slope quickly. Look at how steep it is, and yet you don't see any little stream valleys. How could water have been running down that steep slope for 15,000 years and not created stream valleys? And the answer is obvious. It's made of sand and gravel. So the water goes in, it doesn't run over the land. And when I see that, when I see this pattern of close contours and steep slopes without those little ephemeral stream valleys, I know I'm looking at an ice contact slope. So that's where I can look at this map and see a lot of things that aren't immediately obvious just from looking at the topography. Here's another example of using topographic maps. This is the School Springs mitigation site on the eastern part of the park. This is Route 31 here, Hart's Road that takes you straight into the park from Route 31. And we've put a lot of work into recreating a stream here. This stream was put into a ditch. You can see the remnants of that ditch here through most of the field. This was entirely an agricultural field when I started working for the park. I've forgotten the dates, probably 5 or 6 years ago. We restored this into a prairie. This is a remnant fen over here where water is coming out of the ground. And we can see these streams that are feeding this system. We can see the V in the contours here and here. But look at this one. That doesn't make any sense. Why did I draw that line there? You can see the V in the contour here, but it seems to disappear. That doesn't make any sense. If we look at the aerial photograph, we can see the stream valley because we can actually see the water peeking through the buckthorn and brush. And this is one weakness of topographic maps when they're done in areas of dense vegetation, particularly dense trees. They don't allow the aerial lens to see the ground, and these the topographic lines are put in there by what's called stereoscopic methods, not by a person anymore, but it's automated. But if you can't see the ground, then it doesn't know where that groove in the ground is. So we can see it on the aerial photograph. We can't see it right here. This contour would not indicate a stream valley, but in fact it is there. So again, using multiple resources, you can find the weaknesses of one by using the strengths of the other. So what I've tried to do in this is to give you a broad view using many resources. This has become a sort of mantra that I tell myself as an ecologist when I'm working, is to look at many sources of information, try to use the strengths of all of them, look for multiple sources that are all telling you the same story before you believe it. You can formalize it into something like this, which looks at topography and geology and landform and soils and remnant vegetation and sort of reconstructs patterns, ecological patterns in a landscape here on a broader scale and here on a finer scale. But more likely you can just use it yourself as you do your investigations, not becoming wholly reliant on a floristic quality system or on a soil map or on a topographic map or any of these sources, but using them all and trying to see how one can inform the other. So what can we do with this information? Well, one thing we can't do is go back. As I said before, we can't make the landscape go backward to what it was in the past. But what we can do is to step in and make something like the past. What we can do is use the past as a reference in a model to conserve and restore. So we can take a prairie that turned into a cornfield, and through site preparation and seeding and burning, we can then return it into a prairie again that is at least something like similar to or reminiscent of the original prairie. That's the goal in restoration. Over time, we would hope that prairie would become more complex and interesting, just as the original prairie had thousands of years to develop. But that's what we're trying to do in ecological restoration and using these methods of looking back in time. And next, you're going to listen to the amazing Jackie Bero coming up. But questions? We got a few minutes before 11 o'clock. Any questions? I know I could have had to go through that pretty quickly. I cut out a little bit of the soil stuff that I would have dearly loved to show, but I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. So you couldn't possibly have understood everything I said. I'm not sure I did, so.
Remember to unmute yourself if you're going to ask a question, or type it in the chat box and I'll say that for you.
Hi, Tom. Do you think we'll ever do a soil kind of workshop day?
Well, I'm planning on that. We will do one. You need to inform Jackie of that. She's my boss in these. It may not be obvious, but she's the one who's in charge here. We both, two of us have talked about that, so I think it's something we'll be doing in the near future. That's one I look forward to. Soil is another one of those things that tends to be misinterpreted and overinterpreted. Soil maps are tremendously useful. It's one of the first things I look for when I start working in a new area. For one thing, I see the general patterns. I can look and see how experts in the field have described soils in that area, so I know what terminology to use and what the characteristic patterns I'm looking for and what I'm trying to identify when I'm out in the field. That's super important. But you do have to remember that soil maps were done primarily for agricultural purposes and for development and not for rebuilding native landscapes. They are useful, but over-reliance on them, I think, is just like over-reliance on any resource. It lacks something. So going out in the field and looking at it yourself helps. Looking at topographic maps, looking at public land surveys, looking at firsthand accounts, all of those things are useful.
Somebody mentioned in the comment, we are concerned about Tom's bootlaces.
Oh, that's an interesting story. The video you didn't see, I had the microphone on on a piece of conduit because I was turning the auger and I was going to get tangled up in the cord. So, and I'd forgotten my rubber band to hold the camera, my cell phone to the piece of conduit. So I had to take my bootlace off and tie it on there. And so unfortunately it was my right shoe, or I think it was the left shoe that happened to be forward in that when I was looking at this. So I was wondering if anyone would notice that, you know, that I don't normally walk around without bootlaces, but it was necessary.
Got another question of, are there new topographic maps derived from LiDAR data?
Not that I'm aware of. They do reissue topographic maps with updates. But much of the topography on the maps is the same, has been the same for a number of iterations. The early topographic maps that weren't done with aerial surveys obviously were different. By the time we got to aerial surveys in the middle of the 20th century, the topo lines stayed pretty stable. A 1 to 24,000 topo map, which is the standard one, gives you a lot of detail in working with landscapes. Some of the earlier ones were at a higher scale, 1 to 100,000, and you can't see as much detail on those.
Well, that's all the questions in the chat. Oh, no, there's another one. When were the earliest aerial photos done?
Well, there were scattered ones done earlier. The first, as far as I'm aware, the first systematic survey, I think pretty much across the entire Chicago area, was 1939. So when you look at those, you're looking really at a farm landscape, even in places like, you know, DuPage County, where I worked in the early 90s, that are anything but a farm landscape today. It was certainly a farm landscape then. So you're looking at an area in the middle of a farm. So you are looking back in time. You're not looking at a pre-European settlement landscape. Some people kind of make that mistake. Those are grazed woodlands, grazed to the nub with scattered oak trees, not necessarily exactly like they were 100 years before that, but a very useful resource. And as far as I know, the first systematic one was 1939.
If anybody's interested, the first aerial photograph ever taken, there's not full systematic way of taking them, was in 1858 in a balloon in France.
There you go. So if we could go to France, then we would have an 1858 aerial photograph. I'm not sure they were using stereoscopic images at that time.
Well, it's 11 o'clock, so we had planned for a little intermission if anybody needs to use the restroom. So we'll plan on reconvening at 11:10. If anybody wanted to see that video that we skipped, we could play that. Just say something in the chat
Sure.
box and we can show that during the break.
Well, there were two of them. There was this one. We're going to look at a soil that's similar to the one we looked at just a few minutes ago, but in a different topographic position. We're in a slight depression on the side of a hill, and we want to look at the soil here because in a depression like this, the soil doesn't erode over time. Rather, if there are livestock or any activity in the area that induces soil erosion, what happens is this site gets buried, and so the old soil is still under there. So that's why we want to look in this position, and we can use a couple of different instruments for doing that. This is a simple push tube, and it comes in 4 pieces. I can take it apart and carry it around really easily. You can see it has a little bit less than a 1-inch hole that I push in the ground and take out 1 tube of soil at a time. It's quite handy for moist soil. It doesn't have any rocks. Today we're going to use a larger sampling tool because we'll get a little bit more soil to look at. So we're going to use the Dutch auger, which cores about a 2.5-inch hole. And this is, you push and twist this into the ground. And then pull it up. Now in just a minute, we'll take a closer look at that soil. But for right now, just going to see how we auger into the soil. When you're augering, you're not using your arms. You may look like that. You use your lower body and legs to really provide the torque that moves the auger into the ground, and then you use your legs to pull it out. So far, we've gotten a sort of homogeneous dark brown soil that's very typical of what accumulates from erosion and sedimentation. So we're still looking for the original soil underneath. Yeah, I think we're just about there. Maybe one more. Change in the color of the soil. That's what we were looking for. And I want to go just a little bit deeper to show you the original subsoil, what we would call the B horizon. Yeah, I think we're getting there. Can't stop myself just once more. Okay. We're going to look at a soil that's similar to the one we
Tom, you're muted.
So that was the augering sequence. Notice that there's a slope above me. The soil was being eroded down the slope and deposited in a little depression. Not really depression, just a little flat spot on the hill where I was augering the soil. And I knew this many years ago when I found this. That's what you look for. Geologists taught me this many years ago. Look for these flat spots and depressions to find the ancient soils buried underneath. And one more we looked at just here is just one more soil video. Let's look at another soil that tells us about change over time. We're standing immediately south of Kettle Marsh in Glacial Park. You see the geese out there. And if we pan around, you can see there's a restored prairie on the other side. This was originally an oak woodland. But let's look at the soil. The soil tells us something extremely interesting because you can see here that this whole surface, this is about 20 inches of sediment that's accumulated on top of the original wetland soil. You can see the very dark black color, the high organic matter, that's the original soil, topsoil, and then a wetland subsoil down below. So that's another example of where looking at soils in the field can actually tell you something very interesting about how the site has changed over time. So there, those are two examples of looking at soils. The last one, my cell phone was running out of batteries there, so I had to be pretty quick. But the key thing there is that restored prairie was a cornfield for 100 years. The restored prairie was put there in about 1988. And before that, it was an old field and then a farm field for close to 100 years. And so that's where the sediment came from that buried that southern edge of what we now call Kettle Marsh. That was a considerably larger wetland, particularly on its southern edge, than it is today. Those are the kind of things you can find out really only by going out and looking at the soil in the field. I think you're muted, Jackie. I think you're muted, Jackie. I'm not hearing you.
Oh, there we go. We had another question in the chat. This will probably be the last one before we get started up again on the other part. We had a question, what can you learn from coring remnant prairie soil? May have partially been answered by the video, but go ahead.
Well, I think you can, where there is, well, that's soil that, the first of those two videos was in a grassy field. And there is some other information that might indicate that that was formerly wooded, but one of the things I was looking for was some soil evidence for one or the other. And when I found that zone of leaching, that E horizon in the soil, pretty easy to see in that buried soil, I knew I was looking at a woodland soil. There was woods a few hundred meters to the west, a few scattered trees to the east, and so you put all that evidence together and you're pretty sure it was formerly a woodland area. If I were along the edge of a woods and I were, for instance, restoring an area that was prairie and oak grove, and I wanted to know, and the boundary I knew had been truncated by farming and by clearing, what I would do is I would be moving along in and out of the woods at regular intervals and probing the soil to see how the soil changes along that transect, looking for a change from more acid soils of woodlands to more alkaline soils of prairies to deeper and blacker A horizons, presence or absence of an E horizon, all of those things. I would be looking to try to locate that boundary.
Okay, so
I could talk for weeks on that, but I won't.
So I'm gonna switch controls over here. Tom is going to begin monitoring the chat. And I'm gonna share my presentation. There was a question in the chat of, is there a topographic map of Glacial Park? Which the short answer is yes, and that'll probably be covered in my part of the presentation here. Okay, so now that we've learned
Jackie, the resolution is fuzzy.
Here, I'll fix that again. All right, take two.
It's better.
Okay, so now that we've given you background on sort of the big picture, I wanted to share some resources of things that are freely available online. If you have a site of particular interest to you, we're going to show you how you can access those and how to use them. So there are a lot of resources out there online, and we're going to focus more so on the ones that are on the left-hand side of the screen. And there's not always information available for all of these, or there may be gaps missing. So keep that in mind as we go through. So some general tips when you're looking into these kinds of things is you can use the address as a starting point, but it may not necessarily be as accurate as you need it to be for what you're looking at. For example, if we're looking into parts of Glacial Park, that's a really big area. So it needs to include the range of addresses that might be along Harts Road, for example, or Route 31. So, I had a window popping up there. Okay. With some of these maps too, when you're looking back in time, there may not be structures or roads that you're familiar with. So use some of the water bodies to orient yourself. You can look back on a series of maps or a series of aerial photographs and see more or less the same part of a stream and figure out where you're at, even if it was before anything was built there. And like Tom was talking about, you want to try to get the big picture view. Does it make sense that there would be this kind of soil here on this part of the hill? Does that match what you see on the aerial photo? And it's helpful, especially if you're starting off, to bring some maps in the field to a spot you're familiar with, and that'll help orient you to what that map feature looks like in real life. And then when you go to new places, does it look like what you would expect to see based on what was mapped there? And some of the websites are a little bit touchy, so you may have to try a few different types of keywords or settings, especially if you're doing historical research and you try searching for Glacial Park Conservation Area, but you're looking at resources from the 1920s that wouldn't have existed. Likewise, if you have a setting on in your keyword search that it has to match the exact phrase that you typed in, if you have a typo or it's not recorded exactly the way that you typed it in, it won't show up at all. So try less words is more. So maybe try one part of it or the name of a town. And be patient. There's a lot of things out there. It does have a little bit of a learning curve to use them, but they're so available that there's plenty of ways you can practice with it, or you can reach out to us for help. The aerial photographs, you saw a few of those earlier. They're probably the most intuitive one to understand, and they're very easily accessible. They're very commonly available back to the 1950s. Depending on where you're at, they can go back farther than that. There's not always consistent coverage in between, but it's a good way to look at what's your land cover. For example, is it row crops? Is it a forested area? Is there a stream there that isn't there now? You can look at structures too, and sometimes you can find when they were built. I really like looking at wetlands on historic aerial photographs because you can see what areas were wet, even to when they may have installed drainage tiles or when the drainage tiles were broken, because you can see a darker green on the aerial photograph. So there's a lot of sources out there. I will go through each of these in depth, but Google Earth is a nice free one. Actually, the first three are ones that are nationwide available, and the McHenry County Interactive GIS Viewer is a really nice tool that combines a few different things. So I'm going to save that one till later after talking about several different types of maps. So Google Earth is something that you can download. I recommend using it on your desktop because it's just a little bit easier to navigate. It's a type of GIS, which stands for Geographic Information System. So that means there's a lot of different types of information that are recorded as layers. So you can turn on a layer, you can overlay another layer on top of that. So one layer might be streets, another layer might be an aerial photo. And Google Earth does actually have quite a few recent historic aerial photographs, sometimes back to the 1970s. But there are other resources that go back farther. And there is a related tool that's a website that's not within Google Earth, but you can look up the township range and section, by either using the address or using the latitude and longitude. So that can be helpful if you're looking back at Plat books, for example, for some additional history. So this is what it looks like on the desktop version. You type in an address. For example, I put in our address for the visitor center. That address sometimes pops up over here on Harts Road, sometimes it's anywhere else than the visitor center. Anyone who came to the visitor center for their first time probably experienced. So that's one of those examples where it may be better to use latitude and longitude or something else to help navigate yourself there. I mentioned there are several layers. So down in this bottom left-hand corner is where you can turn them on and off. When there's a checkbox in there, it's on. And when you first download it, it automatically has a bunch of these layers turned on. You really don't need most of those. I pretty much only keep on the borders and labels and the roads for reference. On the right-hand side, there is this zoom bar. So when you're actually logged in, I just took screenshots for the purposes of today, but there's a plus and a minus where you can zoom in. If you're clicking around and you're dragging it, it can turn so that north is no longer at the top. But if you click this little N here on the circle, that will reorient yourself so north is at the top of your map. And because this is linked to Google Maps, this little person here, if you click and drag them onto a street, you can see street view for some places. So that's only useful if you have a road right next to where you're looking at it. So we're going to look at this wetland here and look at the historical imagery tool. So there is this sliding bar over here that gives you all the different options. So each of those lines on here is when there's an aerial photo available. And when you click back on those, you can see you'll just pop up right where the image was. At the bottom, it does show a little bit more specific of an imagery date, which can be useful if you're looking at a wetland, for example. Later in the summer, it's going to look a lot drier. You may not even see the wetland, but if you look a little bit earlier in the summer, where it's typically more rainfall, then you'll see much more water there. So we go back in time a little bit. So 2013, here's what that same wetland looked like. Those darker spots, probably flooding. It could have been a recent rainstorm that was really bad, or maybe it was just a really wet year. 2002, it was a little bit drier. 1999, a little bit wetter again. And 1988, real dry. And you can start to see some of these straight lines. Anytime you see a straight line, that is not natural. So you're probably looking at something that is human caused, like row crops. We go a little bit further east on Harts Road. This is Route 31 and Harts Road intersection. There's a barn right here. And I wanted to see when that barn was constructed. So our date looking at here, April 1999, they happened to have another aerial photograph from March 1999, so we could actually figure out what month that building was constructed. And just a disclaimer, this is a pretty rare situation where you're able to tell the exact month when something was constructed. Usually, if you're lucky, there'll be an aerial photo for each year. But further back you go, you're lucky if you get one for each decade, depending on how far back you're looking. There's a couple of different tools in here if you wanted to experiment with it. There is a ruler tool up here. When you click on that, when you click on your map, you can draw a line and measure your distance. So if I wanted to see how far of a walk it is from the road to that wetland, I can look here. You can change your units by clicking on this drop-down box. You can also put a place mark. So if you wanted to remember a specific survey point, for example, when you click on that, this automatically pops up. You can drag this pin anywhere you want on the screen, and it'll spit out a latitude and longitude for you. You can change the style and color as well if you want to save results, for example. When you click OK and you save it, things will automatically be saved to your temporary places. And when you close Google Earth, it won't be there anymore. But if you want to save it, you drag it up to My Places here. For example, I had some snakeboard surveys from a while back that I had helped out with that I saved in Google Earth. Was there a question? I heard a voice.
No, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. All right, so there's a polygon tool as well, which is kind of neat because this one, when you click on this tool and you click and drag around your feature, you can check out the measurements. So if you wanted to see the area of that wetland, you could figure that out. Or the perimeter. Say you wanted to figure out how long it's going to take you to walk around this thing if that's your survey spot. And again, you can change the units. There's a path tool. Maybe you're parking at this kettle lot over here and you wanted to remember what was the easiest way to get there. You can save your path. And here's that website for EarthPoint, which is related to Google Earth. If you wanted to figure out your township range and section for a site so that you could look back in other resources like Plat Book or other resources, you can type in, I like to do latitude and longitude for this one as opposed to address. But if you're not sure how to get your latitude and longitude back in your Google Earth, you can see down at the bottom, wherever your cursor was hovering over, it will show the latitude and longitude. And that's in the same format as this EarthPoint tool. So I copied and pasted my latitude and longitude here, and it spit out this township range and section. The important thing to remember here is where we're at in the Midwest, it will always be a north latitude and a west longitude. So if you don't put west on here or a negative sign, which means the same thing, you could end up on the other side of the world. So you wouldn't get any results for township range and section. HistoricAerials.com is another free resource that's nationwide. It has some other more distant in the past types of resources for both aerials and topographic maps. So the only issue is it's not really one where you would download anything from it. It has a logo across it because they do charge if you wanted to download it. But I've used this for reference if I was just trying to figure out what was happening at a site and I needed something further back than Google Earth. It also has this really neat sliding bar tool where you can compare whatever year you want of one map to another. So this is what it looks like. You can see that kind of annoying logo on there, but it's not attached to the map. So if you zoom in or out, you can figure out a way to get around the words if they're over something that you specifically wanted to look at. So we're gonna look at the same wetland. You can see over here on the left side, there are aerial photographs all the way back to 1953, which is further than we have in our Google Earth. They also have topographic maps available all the way back to 1926. On the sliding tool, if you click on this compare button over here, say I wanted to see what it had looked like all the way back in 1926 on my topographic map. It'll put that on the left side. And it gives you this other option. You can click either aerials or topos and select which year you wanted that. So I'm comparing 1926 to 2010, and the sliding bar is up here. So if I move that over, it actually does a nice overlay of the image, and I can move that back and forth as many times as I want to figure out what's going on. Another source of aerial photographs is to send in a Freedom of Information Act request. Some places it's called an open records request. depending on what state or county you're in. And the federal agency has the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. They have an aerial photograph program since 1955. So you can send them a request for specific years at that location. And their FOIA request email is freely available online. You could also look up your local NRCS office if they have a FOIA officer that's responsible for responding to those requests. A little more information is available online there for afterwards if you'd like to peruse. So if you're going to send that in, it's just an email. You try to give them as much information as you can on your site. You can give them your specific address. You may want to include an address range, or if you know any historical addresses, because sometimes they can change slightly over time. Parcel numbers, township range section, any big street intersections, like I always would put Route 31 and Harts Road, it's northwest of there. If you can specify if there's particular years you're interested in, that'll make their jobs a lot easier, as opposed to just saying, I want all of the historic aerial photographs you have since the history of time. They may not appreciate that. So if I was going to send a FOIA request for our example site here, this is kind of what it would look like. I want the years 1980 to 2000. Here's the address, but knowing that that's not super specific for Glacial Park and the specific area I'm looking at, I included the parcel number, description that it's northwest of that intersection. I looked up the township range and section, the owner, which we happen to know. So, all right, switching gears a little bit. Topographic maps. The USGS has a really nice tool online that goes back all the way to the 1880s. If you ever need a refresher on how to read topographic maps or what the symbols mean, there's a lot of information online. I just picked a couple of them and threw them on the slide, but that's by no means the only ones out there. So this is what their TopoView website looks like. Anywhere in pink is somewhere that they have coverage for. There are maps for that. And you can enter your address. So again, I entered the visitor center. You can see because it's pink, there are maps for this area. They list them all here at the right side, going all the way back to 1926. And there's this show button you would click if you want to have that overlay on your screen, like so. If you wanted to download that map, you can. I would recommend a JPEG file, which most people are familiar with, just a picture file, or KMZ is compatible with Google Earth, so you could import that into your Google Earth. The GeoTIFF may be a bit big. It often slows down my computer if I'm just trying to look up something on my own. So I'd stick with JPEG or the KMZ file if you're gonna be using Google Earth. You can see all these nice features Tom was pointing out before. So our really close contour lines are showing steep slopes. Where it's more spread out, that's really flat areas like our Nippersink Valley here. There are symbols on here, so obviously not a hard thing to figure out that the blue line is a stream, but what is this dotted line here? So this is an intermittent stream. It may not be there all the time. There's these little blue plant-looking things that mean wetland. You can see there are some schools on here. They call out the specific names of the schools. And you can even see a railroad on here where Prairie Trail is now. One thing that I find interesting about McHenry County is there's all these gravel pits in our history, and sometimes those are specifically called out on our maps. We even have an airport called out here. And in urban areas, it's a little bit more apparent, but you can see even specific names like Shriners Hospital, the name of the owners. That'll help you if you're trying to do any kind of historical research on a place. This red means it's an urban area. It's background color. So switching gears into our floodplain maps. So FEMA is the agency responsible for flood insurance. The main thing they're concerned about is, are you in or out of a 100-year flood zone? So if you want to get more into the details on flood zone, that information is available online. I included the link for that. But you're pretty much just wondering, are you in or out of that 100-year floodplain? And there are side conversations going on. Is the definition of a 100-year floodplain changing? Which we'll have to save that one for another time. My goal is just to show you the website right now. So this is what it looks like. Similar to the others, you enter an address or latitude, longitude. Note that they flip it, so longitude has to be entered first. So if you type it as latitude, longitude, you'll end up somewhere completely different. I've done that many times. And when you put in your address, it should show up this map viewer like this. There's ways to download it if you really want to keep the record of it. And you'll note with the address, instead of being at the visitor center, it put me at Hart's Road here. So that's why you want to orient with your water features. And if you are curious as to more of what's going on there, there's a legend if you just scroll down a little bit that tells you exactly what's going on. We'll zoom in a little bit. So this shaded area is what we're concerned about. Shaded typically means floodplain. And you'll see a squiggly line every so often. That is the base flood elevation. So for example, if a construction project is going on nearby, they have to be constructed above the base flood elevation or outside of that floodplain, versus zone X over here, area of minimal flood hazard. So, and if you look at a floodway, it gets much more colorful. So that's our nipper sink over there. All right, so moving on to soil maps. I was excited to share this part with Tom after we were comparing our presentations. The NRCS has all of this information freely available online. Part of the reason that I really like soil maps is because it's the one feature when you're looking at wetlands that stays there much, much longer. It takes so long for soils to form that if it is a wetland soil, you'll be able to see that even if there's no wetland vegetation or no water in the ground, if it's the dry season. So you can figure out if historically there was a wetland there, even if it's been farmed with drainage tiles for a while. So this is what the website looks like. You want to click into Start WSS. We'll type in our address and take us to, it took us to over here. The navigation on this is a little bit touchy. So I zoomed in on this section up at the top left of the map that shows what kind of tools you have. So this hand here is the pan tool. So then when you click and drag, it moves your screen over so that we can recenter on our area of interest. Speaking of which, you'll notice there's no soils data showing. So we have to select the area that we want to show the soils map for. And this red box that says AOI means area of interest. So we have to click and drag to highlight the area we want the soil information for. So we do that, and there's still no soils information. So it's just saying this is the area you selected. If you want to go back and do that again, you can always clear your AOI if it wasn't zoomed in on the right spot. This is kind of a bigger area than I would typically look up. Usually I'm looking for maybe a boundary of the wetland, so I would maybe focus on a smaller area like that. But this will create kind of a fun map for our example here. So to view your soil information, you have to click on this soil map tab. And that puts the layer on what Tom was showing earlier, where there's different symbols for each type of soil. And there's a list over here of all the different types of soils. if you click on the specific soil, you notice that's a link. It takes you to soil descriptions, which a lot of this, you may be a little bit overwhelmed, like, oh, I don't necessarily need to know all of that information, but I like looking at the hydric soil rating. It's a simple yes or no. Is it a hydric soil, meaning it would support wetland, it would support a wetland there. So related to that are the depth to water table, frequency of flooding and ponding, which can give you an idea if that is going to be a wetter area or not. In case you want to get really crazy with soils, you can look up more detail with the official soil description. If you put into Google the name of the soil that you're interested in, usually the first thing that pops up is this NRCS official soil series description. When you click into that, it gives you a really, really detailed information. Each of these is a layer of soil and a very specific definition of the texture, the color, what may be in there, if it's stratified. So what's cool about that is this literally translates into what you do in the field. So when Tom was out there with the soil probe, when he takes it out, he could say from 0 to 9 inches, the specific color, this black 10YR21, which is something that we figure out with a Munsell soil chart. We compare it, and wherever, these are like paint chip samples almost, wherever it lands on there, you can tell the exact number code for what that color is, and the silty clay loam is the texture for it, so feeling it in your hands. If you scroll down a little bit in that, you can see that the geographic setting of it that talks a little bit about the background geology of the site. So this has outwashed plains, stream terraces, that kind of thing. And sometimes they even include vegetation that are typically on there. Tom mentioned these were made more for agricultural purposes, so you see that in there. But occasionally, if you have especially a specific plant that is very conservative, you can note that it needs a specific kind of soil that may be listed here. Another fun feature, because I like colorful maps, is if you go into the Soil Data Explorer, there's a lot of things in here, but the main one that I like to use is under land classifications. You get an expanded list here, and you click the hydric rating by map unit. So that says how wet is the soil. And it doesn't automatically show up when you click on it. You have to click view rating. But when you do that, it color codes each of these soils. So red is wet and the green is dry. So that matches more or less what we would expect to see. So our wetland area is nice and red. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see the hydric rating of the soils. So something that is 100, that's 100% chance that it's a wetland soil. 0, it's not very likely to be a wetland soil. So you can figure out more detail about it that way. All right, switching a little bit more into cultural resources. There are these fire insurance maps. There was a Sanborn map publishing company that started mapping particularly urban areas since the 1860s. So these are, I wanted to include them even though we're talking about natural areas, just in case anybody's interested in doing research beyond that. It may be related to your site or the development of the area. And they're kind of neat when you start looking through them. So I looked up on this website the Sanborn fire insurance map for Crystal Lake. Note that it goes all the way back to 1893. So these go further back because this was before we had a good way to map things for the firefighters that were going in. They wanted to know about what structures were available when they had to go fight fires and what kind of materials they were going to be working with. So when you click into it, you may have to click in a few times to get zoomed in. So I clicked on view images, and then I wanted to see image 1 and zoom in on it. So here's our zoomed in map. If I wanted to look at this parcel over here in the corner, some interesting things to note are these numbers on the side. So these are all of the possible street addresses for that parcel of land. So if I wanted to send in a FOIA request, that open records request, to get more history on that site, I would include all of these addresses: 507 Williams Avenue, 307 and 308 Brink Avenue. And when you're looking through historical resources, it may show up only under one of these. So if you don't include that, you may miss something. It's neat too that they include sometimes specific owner names or purposes. You can see this was a horse shed and a church. Versus over here, the D stands for dwelling. And you can even see these little numbers here, 1 and 2. That means it was a 2-story dwelling. We go a little bit further northeast in the town. I just thought this was kind of fun. But they said there were no steam and no hand engines there. And there's a pickle factory over here. But also you can just tell if there's a public school or another type of structure there. So Tom talked a bit about land survey plat books. Those are a really good resource for historical land ownership and those property boundaries, particularly in rural areas. These are probably more of one that you would need to make an in-person appointment to view. I tried looking up online a few pieces of information for McHenry County, and I could find that it existed, but I couldn't actually access it. So some places you could look for these are places like our conservation district has a research library, we'll talk a little bit about later, or your local library may have some of that information. This is what it would look like, and you notice that has that township range and section on there. So useful when you're comparing it to historical resources still. Kind of an updated version of that now. Many places will have an interactive GIS where parcels are mapped. Particularly the property tax assessors will need this information. If anyone's gone to appeal their taxes, for example, and you need to know your parcel number, these kind of maps are a way to look up a parcel number for property that you don't own. So it shows more of the current boundaries in land ownership. Again, I'll save the interactive GIS for McHenry County until the end, but many counties do have something like that. Most counties in the US have a parcel search online for their property assessor. The property assessor I mainly use to find the owner information. So if I want to know if it was a farm or an apple orchard, or was it just somebody's house, it was a residence. They can have very useful information just from finding out who the owner is. And these websites can be a little bit touchy, so I prefer to search by the parcel number, and I threw in a parcel number for somewhere in Glacial Park there. But if you are searching for a property using the address, even if I know the number, that say we were looking at 6316 Harts Road, instead of writing that, I would put the address range from 6300 to 6200 and Harts in there. I wouldn't even put road, because sometimes when you put the abbreviation at the end, it complicates the search. So anywho, then we click into that. You get some current information on your site. Usually the owner name is always there. They may include a legal description, and sometimes they include sales history, so that can be useful for figuring out who was the previous owner, but that's not always there. For payment history, it gives you an idea of how long that owner has had the property. I'm starting to run a little bit short on time, so I'll try to go in detail on this GIS viewer here, and then may have to rush through a couple of the other things. So this GIS viewer is very helpful because everything that we just talked about, it overlays them on each other. It's more so those current layers and not as much historical information. But it's very similar to the others where you can search by parcel or address. So if I search by this parcel we've been looking at, there's all of these map layers on the left side. You can choose which ones to turn on. And so I turned on the parcel text one. This is another way you can figure out, it links to the property assessor. So if I click on my property and then I click on property info, it will show me the parcel number. I could search on this. For example, if I didn't know the parcel number, I could look up the address, click on it. That's how I could find the parcel number. And we show details, and it gives us a little snippet of that tax assessor page with the current property owner. That's another way to find it. If I want to look at the soil map, when I turn on a layer, suddenly we don't know where we are. So I want to fix this transparency so that we can see our base map, which was just a street map. So you can move this over to the right a little bit. You can still see the soils, but also see your base map. You can do this with any of the other layers that are on here, like the flood zone. We could see part of that property is in a floodway. Or sorry, not a floodway, that's the red stripes over here. You can even turn on multiple layers at the same time. It's just the more layers you add, the more complicated it looks. You can turn them on for reference, but it may be easier to do one at a time. This other website is part of McHenry County's GIS as well for historic resources. It's technically a different viewer, but they do have historical aerial photos back to 1914. You can check with different locations for historical archives, like your local library. Some of them have newspapers, history books, microfiche, genealogical information, all sorts of stuff, and they can help you learn how to use it as well. Or sometimes some online websites. So our historical archivist, Bailey, recommended this Trust website, which you can use to search historical documents. It's everything scanned in, and you can search within the document by keyword. And so she found this History of McHenry County book from 1922. And this is the website I actually looked for the Plat Book on, but when I clicked into it, you couldn't actually access it. So when you scroll down, when you're searching, you want to make sure there's a full view available. Otherwise, you have to make an appointment in person with whoever is the original source to access it. So here's what that book looks like. You put your search information in here, knowing that this is from 1922. If I search for Glacial Park Conservation Area, it doesn't exist. So I want to search for something like McHenry Township. But lo and behold, it's there. It does have a nice index in there. So if I see that this starts on page 433, I can jump to that page, get more information about the settlers, Native Americans. The history books are great from the standpoint of there's a lot of information out there. It may not be super specific to your site, and there's quite a bit of variation depending on where you are in the country, or it depends on, if you had people that were willing to write all this stuff down. There are usually historical societies for each county. You Google search, you can figure out who to contact, and sometimes they do have more in-depth resources available online. Note that there's a shout out to us at the Conservation District. So we do have a research library. It has quite a few resources that are free if you want to come in and take a look at them. Under normal circumstances, you would make a weekday appointment with Gail Brown, who manages our research library. And you can check out, or not, not physically check out, but you can come look at the resources, make scans for free, or be emailed digital copies. She can kind of talk you through, if you're trying to look into certain information, what would be the best resource. And we've got all sorts of stuff: township maps, census and survey notes, agricultural records, history books, some travel diaries, which are some of the quotes that Tom had at the beginning, and Native American reference books. We also have this really cool interview project. I don't think this is publicly available at this time, but it's sort of an ongoing research project. So I will play this video for you.
Hello, I am Bailey Rewalt, and I'm going to give you a short presentation on our cultural history resources and how to find them. On the left.
1 second, I forgot I had to share the sound on this. Okay.
Hello, I am Bailey Rewalt, and I'm going to give you a short presentation on our cultural history resources and how to find them. On the left is an article about Thomas Carr, who was one of the first pioneers in Glacial Park. In the middle is a picture of farm buildings at Prairie View Education Center, and on the right is a picture of Glacial Park presently. We have 154 total interviews on the history of McHenry County and on district sites. Unfortunately, with the software I'm using, I cannot record clips of the interviews, but I will describe some of the content of some of the interviews as examples. So in this specific example, Larry Bruce is talking about his childhood near Glacial Park and how he would go on school field trips with a man named Frank Fay. And Frank Fay remembered when there were Native Americans that would come and visit in this area, and about all the turkeys that lived in the area, and he goes on to talk about that. There are 74 interviews that are focused specifically on MCCD sites. This is another example of an interview we have with Florence Smith talking about when she and her husband worked for Frank Howard. On the right is a picture of Frank Howard, and she talks about how Frank Howard had flamingos that he kept at Lost Valley Visitor Center and how they just didn't live very long, and once they had died, Frank Howard had them stuffed and then displayed in his house here. This outlines the Howard parcel and all the property he owned. There are 38 movies that I have digitized from VHS tapes and are now available on our servers. This is another example of an interview with Rosemary Bobb and Donna Bilowa, and they talk about their summers they spent with their aunt and uncle where the research field station was, and how their aunt and uncle would run it a bit like a resort, and all the cousins would come and stay, and there'd be mattresses all over the attic, and the kids would sleep over and have fun exploring the woods and the prairie and everything around that area.
So with that, we've given you a lot of information, and no worries, you can check out the recording of this later if you don't remember it all. We have a YouTube channel at Discover MCCD. Search for us under the Tom Talks playlist. Of course, we had to bring this back to Oaks. So I found a story about how acorns were in Scandinavian folklore seen as a lucky nut. So the story goes that Thor hid under an oak tree during a storm, and so people would put acorns by their windows to protect them from lightning. And apparently it also kept you young. So with that, good luck in your search, and we can take any questions. I think I see a couple of questions that were in the chat that I wasn't able to see while presenting, but Tom, you might answer this one a little bit better. Can you explain the soil survey process and how often it's updated?
Well, that I'm not sure there's a real general answer to that, but it's not updated often. There are probably 3 or 4 soil surveys from the over the last 100 years in McHenry County. They become more detailed as time goes on. If you look at several ones, you can see how they're sort of revising and adjusting lines they've already drawn in the past. So it's not at regular intervals. And the general answer to that is to call up the NRCS office and ask, or to find a library and see what's available, because there will be generally several in the eastern United States. Obviously, there are some very thinly populated areas in the West where there still may be no soil survey, but there are generally several editions. You'll probably want to get the most recent one. I don't know of any advantages to using the older ones, but if you have time, you can look through several different soil surveys.
I do want to note, just for everybody that's on the call, it's almost noon, so if you have to jump off, that's totally fine. We will continue answering questions until there are no more. So in the chat, we have a comment. I have at times acquired General Land Office PLS surveyor's notes for different areas, but is there a good online address of obtaining the surveyor's notes and maps?
I don't know of anywhere where you can, we have all of those notes in the Lost Valley Visitor Center library, and you can see them by appointment. I don't know of anywhere online, maybe one of the people listening knows that, but I don't know of anywhere online where you can get them. It takes some time to learn because they are written longhand. The script that it's written in is not easy for 21st century eyes to read, but it is possible. You'll get used to it. Yeah, in other counties, generally county courthouses may have those records, but I don't know of anywhere online to get the full text of the surveyor's notes.
We have a couple of questions about the links for these resources, if we're going to be including them under the YouTube video or via email. So that's a great suggestion to include it under the comments in the YouTube video. I'm going to write that down for myself. We had planned to send out a PDF of the presentations to all participants or people that had signed up. So I will make a note to do that. While I'm writing that down, Tom, we had a question. What creek did you almost fall into in the beginning?
Well, it was Nippersink Creek. I did fall into it, but that wasn't the one on the video. I guess it's some wet feet after that, but yeah, that was right near on the shores of Nippersink Creek, just west of 31.
Let's see. Had several thank yous and learned a lot. What's up next for topics? So we're discussing what we're thinking about for the next programs. We are definitely open to suggestions. I know Tom had mentioned being interested in soils and spring wildflowers, possibly controversies and prescribed burns. So what we'll probably do is discuss it a bit next week, regroup. We don't have anything scheduled for next week, and release another set of presentations. Did you want to add anything to that, Tom?
No, I think, this is your chance to, Jackie, you can collect your emails and ideas. If you have ideas about what you would like to see, let us know about it. Yeah, we'll do the best we can. It's been fun, the first 3, and I look forward to doing more of them.
Awesome. Does anybody else have other questions? You can add it to the chat or unmute yourself and ask. Well, I think that's about it. So thank you guys very much for coming today. We hope to see you next time.
Thank you. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing all of you next time.